Good afternoon and welcome to this episode of Staff Talk. We're here with Virginia Brown, our youth director, Tiffany Jones. We don't always introduce ourselves.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm Matt Daniels. I'm the pastor here at BB First United Methodist Church. And this is a time each week where we get together. We're reading together Adam Hamilton's book, Making Sense of the Bible. I'd highly recommend this if you're a Christian seeking to learn and understand the Bible more deeply. It might challenge you in some ways. And so what we do is we kind of get together each week to talk about how the chapter we read kind of sets with us. And so this week's chapter is entitled Suffering, Divine Providence in the Bible. And so we want to talk a little bit this week about how God really controls or is in work in our world. Is he moving everything like chess pieces, or is he like the deist used to say, where he just started things in motion? And Virginia's going to talk to us a little bit about some competing views of what it looks like for God to be providential. In other words, to be in control. How much control does God have, and what that means for us as followers. So.
All right. So I kind of drew this up on the board, kind of talking about the extremes of like how people view God in their everyday lives. You have the HyperCalvinistic side and determinism, that everything is God's plan, that He's put it into motion, that He has His kind of chess pieces, that He's deciding everything, that God is the micromanager. And I played a lot of Sims growing up. I'm a millennial, that's what we did. And playing the Sims, you choose every action of every character that you have, and some people believe that that's how God does. So God is the micromanager. And on the flip side of that, so the other extreme, is that God is the absentee landlord, that He created our world, and then He just stepped back and He's like, here they are. It's another name for it is deism. And so we're going to talk about how maybe living in these extremes is not where we want to be, but trying to figure out kind of like a happy medium of these two.
Okay, great job, Virginia, on that. Great helping us understand kind of those from a visual point. The problem that comes with both of these ideas, this hyper-Calvinism, this idea that God moves the pieces, is that when something bad happens, what do people say? What do they say? You hear people say
everything happens for a reason.
Yeah, or it's God's will.
Yeah.
But the problem with that is so what if your 5-year-old? Well, we'll just make it personal. So are we supposed to believe that because Scout got cancer and died, that was God's will for her? I just can't. I can't stomach that. I can't even begin to think about worshiping or loving a God that would do something like that. Right. And so there's this idea that God does that, and you got to be careful, because it's easy on one side to say, God did this good thing for me, but if you're going to say that,
just say the other.
And you kind of have a story that relates to that, right?
So this is a little bit more lighthearted, just so y'all know. But like one time I was sitting in the office, and there were people that were upset about intinction for communion, and I said, probably Russell and Virginia, we were sitting in a room, and I said, well, if you get sick from intinction, you got a bigger problem than that. And Russell's like, whoa, wait, hold on. You can't say that, because when you say that, you're putting things on the other side too. Yeah. As you can't, like, you're making it, and he knew I was joking, but he was proving a point that you can't joke about one thing and then it not apply to both sides.
You can't pick and choose here how much God controls. If you say God controls these things, you got to chase that rabbit all the way down the hole. Mm-hmm. And so if you're going to say God, so for instance, I've heard people say, oh, I was at the store and God opened a parking lot right at the front for me. So if you're going to say that, you have to also say that the people who didn't get a parking spot, or have you ever heard things like, God healed so-and-so, well, what about the people He didn't heal? And one of the things that people like to say is that God's punishing people. Well, we need to back up, I guess, a little bit, because in the Old Testament, in the prevailing view of the worldview of things was that anything that happened, it was because God caused it. Right. Because they didn't understand science, and they didn't understand a lot of things that we know today, and so it had to be God. And so good things were from God, and bad things are from God, but later in the Old Testament, you start to find people pushing back against this idea that God controls everything, and that God makes the good and the bad, and that is this hyper-Calvinist idea that God's in control. And you see that through the idea of suffering in the book of Job. Mm-hmm. You see, Job didn't do anything wrong. No. And yet Job suffered.
Oh yeah.
And so if God punishes people, if suffering is God's punishment, then why would somebody who's done good be punished? Mm-hmm. And likewise, we ask the question oftentimes, why do bad people prosper?
Right.
So that becomes problematic with this determinism, this God's plan. There are lots of things like that you've got to start to explain away why things happen that are not so wonderful in this world. And then when you get to the other side, what problems do you guys see with that, with this absentee landlord thing, with this idea that God set the natural laws in motion, set them, and we did.
Because we see God in all kinds of places that aren't just, like, that's where it's problematic for me, is that you see it in people, you see it in things that are happening. You know, like, are you just saying, well, but just because he
or
put
that
in
God
motion.
really doesn't kind of care.
Yeah.
He doesn't care at
He doesn't
all.
care
Like,
what happened.
yeah.
Both of these kind of say God doesn't care. I'm not going to do anything I don't care. I'm going to punish you. I'm going to do mean things. I mean, when was the last time you thought, I'm going to do something hurtful to my kids so they can learn a lesson?
Right.
We don't do those
No.
things. And if that's not in us as humans, you'd think God's far above us and his ability to love and care.
Right.
And so you get this sense of real problem. So there are two things that I think people often, that are hyper-Calvinist or who believe that everything happens exactly according to God's will, is there's two things they believe that happen when somebody is when something bad happens to you. They'll either say, I'm being punished, and that causes them to think about what they've done.
Yeah.
What could have I possibly done? Matter of fact, in the book he writes about a guy whose daughter was killed in a car accident, and he says to Adam, he says, what have I done so bad that God would take my daughter? And that's just that's problematic in so many ways.
And I feel like the opposite of that is that God is testing me.
Right, and so what am I? And when bad things happen, sometimes you're like, what am I supposed to learn from this?
Yeah.
And
it's a test.
Right.
But Adam says the problem with both of these things is it leaves God squarely at the source of sorrow.
Yeah.
And we believe God is a source of joy and love and abundance, and to think that God is a source of sorrow is difficult. But the thing is that I've talked about this before, that God wastes nothing.
Right.
And so it's not that God causes these things for you to learn something, but that because they happen, God uses them. And matter of fact, I don't know if you want to end with it, but that paragraph you were showing a minute ago is wonderful about that. Would you read that for me?
Suffering is not God's desire for us, but it occurs in the process of life. Suffering is not to teach us something, but through it we may learn. Suffering is not given others something, but through it they may learn. Suffering is not given to punish us, but sometimes it is a consequence of our sin or poor judgment. Suffering does not occur because our faith is weak, but through it our faith may be strengthened. God does not depend on human suffering to achieve his purpose, but sometimes through suffering his purposes are achieved.
That's so perfect right there. God does not use suffering to achieve his purposes, but sometimes through suffering God's purposes are achieved.
Yeah.
See, it's all about motive here, and it's all about what God does, and it's not about God bringing the pain. It's about God redeeming the pain.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's the real joy. That's the real hope. That's that middle ground, right? God. Bad things happen because we're people,
And other people are people.
and we make mistakes, and we treat our bodies bad, and the earth bad, and we treat each other bad, and so bad things happen. We're not paying attention. We have wrecks. We do all kinds of things, and then God steps in, and we can either say God caused that, and I'm supposed to learn something, or I'm being punished, or God's going to redeem that, and I will learn something, and I will be made better.
Right.
It's to me, it's a beautiful, and I can't fathom to go although I'll tell you, there are times when doubt creeps in that you want to go to this far other extreme, where God is this absentee landlord, and you're like, God, where are you in the middle of suffering? I remember when my dad was in the car accident, I remember thinking, where are you, God? Why are you not here?
Well, and that's the whole thing. What he says here also, when he's talking about the guy that lost their kid, and it says, and they don't believe God took their son, but they do believe God welcomed their son with open arms, and that one day they will see him again.
There you go. So.
Yeah. I like the last sentence in this whole chapter, and it says, God will bring good from evil, and not even death can separate us from his love.
So what I would encourage you to do is, whatever you believe about any of this, to not just believe what you've been told or believe what you've always believed, but actually really give this some thought. Think about, if I really think that everything is the will of God, what does that really mean? What am I saying about who God is? And the thing that's, because sometimes when people are hurt, we'll say something like, well, it was God's will. And we're trying, sometimes because we don't know what else to say. But you need to understand that a lot of people have been scared away, run off from God because if it's God's will that my child should die, then I'm not exactly sure that's the kind of God I want anything to do with.
I mean, that would be a very heart-wrenching thing live through.
Yeah.
And the other problem with hyper-Calvinism for me is, at least, if God controls everything, did I really choose what I had for breakfast this morning?
Yeah.
I mean, I
Why
believe...
is it so hard to pick that restaurant?
I believe God gives us free
Yeah.
will. And in giving us free will, he automatically, I preached about this a couple weeks ago, automatically gives up power and does not control everything because he lets us make choices.
Yeah. I think moving from this, trying to remove phrases that maybe you've tried to offer in comfort before, trying to remove those and not saying things like everything happens for a reason or it was God's will. Try to think of something actual, like from the heart to say instead of these empty phrases.
I think that's and think about what you're saying about God and about what that means to that person before you say those things, because there's so much a part of our vernacular in the South that can really do some damage without even really, we can convey things about God that we don't even believe.
Right.
You know, because I know there are people who do not believe God moves everybody like chess pieces, but yet there are times they'll say it was God's will.
Right.
But I do want to leave us with this, that I do think some things are God's will. Okay, so I don't want you to hear that.
Yeah, some things are, absolutely.
I think when God called me to seminary, I thought that was part of his will for my life, but I had to listen and I had to respond. And so God's constantly...
He didn't make you go to seminary.
Yeah.
But his will for me was to do that. I believe that. And I believe he spoke to me and he urged me, but ultimately it was my decision.
Right.
And that's how I think God interacts with us. And so you have to remember, constantly, you get a chance to listen to what God's calling you to do or not.
Right.
And we're constantly co-creating with God since the very beginning. Adam and Eve and all that, we have constantly been co-creators with God, and so in some ways we're co-creating the will of God, and we can either make it. We pray it every week. May your will be done on earth as it is in heaven.
Right.
And that's really for us to help make his will done, not because he powers it over us, but because he creates with us, and we get the opportunity to love people.
Well, and that's something we've always been taught here at this church, is that we are the answer to God's prayers. Each other's prayers.
Right.
Yeah. We're God's answer to each other.
That's right. We're the first line, of those things. So this can be difficult for some people. What's interesting, I don't think it was particularly that hard for the three of us, but we
probably wrestled with it longer than
we've had to deal with it. And so if you've never dealt with it, and as always, if it causes you issues and you want to talk, don't feel free to call us. But again, I would recommend the book. It's Adam Hamilton's Making Sense of the Bible. I have copies at the church. If you want one, we will deliver them. And thanks again. You have anything, closing comments?
No.
Thanks for your diagram this week.
Oh, you're welcome.
And, all right.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.